The road that led to Wilma Green's property was little more than a strip of cracked asphalt cutting through miles of dry farmland. Reporter Mike Smith had been driving for nearly an hour since leaving the nearest town, and the landscape hadn't changed much since. Fields stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional fence line or abandoned structure leaning under decades of wind and sun. This part of California had once been farmland that thrived during the war years, when every acre of land was pushed to produce. Now most of it sat quiet and underworked, with only a few isolated farms still operating. Wilma Green's property sat at the end of a narrow dirt road branching off the main highway. Mike almost missed the turn. A rusted mailbox and a faded wooden sign marked the entrance, though the lettering had long since worn away. When Mike finally pulled up, the house looked exactly like the kind of place someone would disappear into if they wanted to be left alone. A small farmhouse stood at the center of the property, surrounded by wide fields and a few aging outbuildings. A weathered barn leaned slightly to one side. Old farm equipment rested half-sunk in the dirt nearby. The place was quiet, too quiet for the middle of the afternoon. Mike stepped out of his car and looked across the fields. Wind pushed slowly through rows of dry grass, creating a soft rustling sound that carried across the open land. Beyond the fields, a line of trees marked the edge of a small wooded area. Wilma Green was already standing on the porch when he approached. She looked smaller than he expected. Frail, but upright. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly, and her clothes were simple, practical farm wear that looked decades out of fashion. But there was nothing confused or fragile about her eyes. They were clear and sharp as she watched him walk up the dirt path. "You must be Mr. Smith," she said calmly. Mike introduced himself and shook her hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. He explained again why he had come, even though she already knew. He had contacted her weeks earlier after discovering her name buried in a series of old local records and newspaper fragments from the early 1940s. Her story had appeared briefly in a few small publications decades ago, dismissed at the time as the confused memory of a traumatized survivor. Still, it had caught his attention. Wilma Green claimed that during the Second World War, there had been an attack on American soil that had never been recorded in any official history. Not Pearl Harbor, not a submarine strike or a bombing run. Something else. Something that had happened along the California coast, near the farmland where she still lived. Mike followed Wilma inside the house, where she had already prepared a small table for the interview. A tape recorder sat between them once he finished setting up his equipment. The house smelled faintly of dust and wood, but everything inside was clean and carefully maintained. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly in every direction. Mike started the recorder. "So, Mrs. Green," he said, "you told me in your letter that what happened here during the war was never reported properly." Wilma folded her hands on the table and nodded. "That's right." Her voice carried no hesitation. Mike leaned forward slightly, waiting. She looked past him for a moment, as if measuring how much to say. "It was 1944, she began. At least that's what the calendar said. We were a small settlement back then. Farms, mostly. Families that had been there for generations." Mike let her speak without interrupting. "The soldiers came by boat," Wilma continued. "We saw them land along the coast early in the morning." Mike frowned slightly. "American soldiers?" "That's what we thought." According to Wilma, the men who arrived wore uniforms that appeared American at first glance. The same colors, the same shapes. They moved in formation as they came inland from the shore, carrying equipment and weapons. The townspeople assumed they were part of a training operation or a temporary military deployment. During the war, strange movements of troops weren't unusual along the coast. No one questioned it, not at first. They didn't speak much, Wilma said, just kept moving inland. Mike made a few notes. There was nothing extraordinary about the story so far. It sounded like the kind of rumor that grew over decades in isolated communities, a misidentified training unit, a supply movement that had been forgotten by history. But Wilma didn't sound uncertain. She spoke carefully, as if describing events she had replayed in her mind for most of her life. "They walked straight past the farms," she said. "Didn't stop to talk to anyone, didn't ask for directions." Mike asked a few questions about the uniforms, about how many soldiers there were, about where they had gone. Wilma answered each one with the same steady tone. About 10 men had come ashore. They moved inland together. And then something happened. Something no one could explain. Mike noticed that Wilma paused before continuing. The first hesitation she had shown since the interview began. "The soldiers changed," she said finally. Mike raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Wilma looked down briefly at the table before meeting his eyes again. They weren't men anymore. Mike assumed she was describing confusion or panic, maybe hallucinations from wartime stress. Stories like that often grew out of trauma. But Wilma continued speaking as if she expected him to understand. "They started merging," she said. Mike said nothing. Their bodies didn't stay separate. He waited. "They came together," Wilma said quietly, like they were being pulled into one shape. The room felt strangely quiet as she spoke. Outside, the wind continued moving through the fields. Mike wrote something in his notebook, though he wasn't sure what yet. He had expected exaggeration, memory distortion, maybe even deliberate fabrication. But Wilma didn't sound like someone telling a dramatic story. She sounded like someone recalling something she had spent decades trying to make sense of. Mike cleared his throat. "And what happened next?" Wilma looked toward the window for a moment. "The attack," she said. Mike's pen stopped moving. "The attack?" Wilma nodded once. "That's when people started dying." Her voice remained steady, but the words hung in the air longer than anything she had said before. "It killed 50 people that night." Mike stared at her. 50? Wilma nodded again. "Families, farmers, anyone who was still there." Mike slowly set his pen down. "And you're saying," he said carefully, "that no one else survived?" Wilma's eyes met his. "No," she said. Her answer came without hesitation. "I'm the only one who did." Wilma did not raise her voice as she continued the story. The calm way she spoke about it was what made Mike uneasy. Outside, the wind brushed slowly across the fields surrounding the farmhouse, bending the dry grass in quiet waves. From the kitchen window, the land stretched flat and empty for miles. Wilma remained seated at the table, her hands folded together, her eyes no longer on Mike but somewhere farther away. "The soldiers didn't stop at the shore," she said. Mike nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. "They moved inland," she went on, "right through the farms. In 1944, the area had been more crowded than it was now. Several small farming families lived along the coast and further inland. Crops stretched across wide fields. Livestock grazed behind wooden fences. It had been a quiet place. People noticed strangers immediately. When we first saw them, Wilma said, no one thought anything was wrong. The soldiers had come ashore early that morning. Their boat had landed quietly along the rocky coastline just a few miles away. A handful of local fishermen had seen them disembark. The uniforms had looked American. That was enough. They walked straight past the houses, Wilma said. Didn't stop. Didn't talk to anyone. Mike listened carefully. Wilma explained that the men moved as a group, about 10 of them in total. They kept their distance from the farms but didn't try to hide themselves either. People assumed they were part of some military operation connected to the war. At the time, no one questioned it. They headed toward the fields, Wilma continued. Her voice slowed slightly. That's when something started to feel wrong. Mike leaned forward a little. What do you mean? Wilma looked down at the table for a moment before answering. They weren't walking normally anymore. At first it was subtle. The soldiers began moving unevenly. Their steps became unsteady, like they were struggling to keep their balance. A few of them stumbled. One of them dropped to his knees. Farmers watching from a distance assumed they were injured or exhausted. Then the sound started. Mike noticed that Wilma paused again before describing what happened next. The bones, she said quietly. Mike frowned slightly. The bones breaking. The soldiers collapsed one after another. From where the townspeople watched, the men appeared to be having violent seizures. Their bodies twisted unnaturally. limbs bent in directions they weren't meant to bend. Even at a distance, people could hear the snapping sounds. Mike felt a chill move across his arms as she spoke. People ran toward them, Wilma continued. They thought the soldiers were dying. But the closer anyone got, the worse the scene became. The men were no longer separate bodies. Their limbs began to press together. Arms tangled, shoulders pushed into each other. Bones forced their way under skin in grotesque angles. Their uniforms tore as their bodies shifted and bent. It didn't look possible, Wilma said. Mike stopped writing in his notebook. Like they were being pulled together, she continued. The men writhed on the ground as their bodies forced themselves into a single shape. Knees folded under torsos that were no longer separate. Arms stretched and twisted together. Several heads pressed against each other before sinking beneath a growing mass of flesh and bone. The screaming had stopped by then. Not because the men were dead. Because their lungs were no longer where they had been. When the movement finally stopped, there was no group of soldiers left. There was only one body, a single grotesque form lying in the dirt where they had collapsed. Mike stared at Wilma. "And then?" he asked quietly. Wilma's expression remained calm, though her eyes seemed darker now. Then it stood up. The creature rose slowly from the ground. It was taller than any man had been. Its body carried too many limbs, stretched in unnatural proportions. Several arms hung from its torso, each ending in long, clawed hands. 4 legs supported its weight, though they bent strangely as it moved. And its face. Wilma hesitated again. There wasn't just one face, she said. Mike felt his throat tighten. 8 eyes, she continued, all open at the same time. The creature's head twisted as it looked around the fields. Several of the arms flexed. The body adjusted itself like something learning how to move for the first time. Then it began walking. The settlement had no defenses. The farms were scattered across the land, connected by narrow dirt roads and fences meant to keep livestock contained, not monsters out. People ran. Families tried to reach their houses. Some ran for trucks or barns. It didn't matter. The thing moved fast, Wilma said, faster than something that size should have been able to move. Its long arms reached for people trying to escape. Some were grabbed and pulled back before they could reach cover. Others were caught as they tried to climb fences or hide behind buildings. Mike didn't ask for details. Wilma didn't offer them. She simply described the panic that followed. 50 people died that day. Farmers, families, neighbors who had lived on the land for generations. Wilma had been a teenager at the time. Her family home had been close to the edge of the fields. When the creature moved toward the settlement, she had been sent to fetch water from a nearby pump. She wasn't inside the house when the attack began. By the time she returned, everything had already collapsed into chaos. She never saw her parents again. Mike remained silent as she spoke. The wind outside rattled softly against the windows. "What happened to it?" Mike asked after a long moment. Wilma slowly turned her head toward the fields beyond the house. Her voice dropped slightly. It didn't stay above ground. After the killing stopped, the creature wandered through the fields for several minutes. Then something strange happened. The ground itself seemed to open beneath it. The dirt collapsed, Wilma said. The creature sank slowly into the soil, as if something beneath the earth had pulled it downward. No explosion, no crater, just the ground swallowing the body piece by piece. Within moments, the fields looked normal again. The creature had vanished. Wilma turned back toward Mike. "It went underground," she said. Her voice remained steady, and it never left. For a while, Mike didn't say anything. The recorder on the table continued running, its small red light glowing steadily between them. Outside the farmhouse, the afternoon had begun to fade toward evening. The fields beyond the windows were turning darker as the sun slowly dropped behind the distant hills. Mike finally cleared his throat and leaned back slightly in his chair. "And you're saying it never came back?" he asked carefully. Wilma shook her head once. "Oh, it came back," she said. Her tone didn't change. Mike paused. "What do you mean?" Wilma rested her hands calmly on the table again. It didn't leave, she explained. Not really. She glanced briefly toward the window that looked out across the fields behind the farmhouse. It just moved somewhere else. Mike followed her gaze. The land behind the house stretched out in long rows of dry farmland. The soil looked uneven in places, shaped by decades of farming and irrigation trenches. Old fences ran along the edges of the property, some leaning badly from age. Nothing moved out there. It went underground, Wilma said. Mike turned back to her. Into the fields? Wilma nodded. Deeper than that. She explained that the farms in the area had once relied on a large underground water system. Decades earlier, a massive storage tank had been built beneath the land to collect and distribute water across the surrounding farms. The tank was enormous, concrete-lined, buried far below the surface. It had supplied water to the fields for years before newer irrigation systems replaced it. The pipes are still there, Wilma said. Most of them anyway. Mike frowned slightly. You think the creature lives down there? Wilma didn't hesitate. I know it does. Mike glanced briefly at his notes. It was the first moment in the conversation where he felt a stronger push of skepticism rising. Up until now, the story had sounded like the kind of local legend that might grow out of wartime confusion and decades of retelling. But now Wilma was speaking as if the creature were still present, still alive, still part of the land. You've seen it again? Mike asked. Wilma gave a small nod. Not often. She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. But enough. Mike waited. The first time was a few months after the attack, she said. The farms had already started emptying out by then. People didn't want to stay. According to Wilma, the settlement had fallen apart quickly after the incident. Families packed their belongings and left. The government sent a few investigators, but nothing was ever officially reported. Eventually, the land simply became quiet, except for Wilma. She had stayed. Why? Mike asked. Wilma looked at him for a moment before answering. Someone had to. Mike didn't respond. Wilma continued. The first time the creature surfaced again, it didn't attack anyone. There was no one left nearby. Instead, it appeared along the edge of one of the empty fields. It came out of the ground, she said, just long enough to look around. Mike felt a faint tension creep into his shoulders. And then, he asked, then it went back down. Wilma spoke about it as if describing a large animal that occasionally wandered through the property. Over the years, she began noticing patterns. The ground sometimes shifted slightly in certain areas. Animals disappeared from nearby farms. The old water system beneath the fields remained partially active, still holding large amounts of groundwater. It drinks from the tank, Wilma said. Mike blinked. Drinks? Wilma nodded. The pipes connect all through the land down there. The tank still fills when it rains enough. She looked toward the fields again. That's where it stays most of the time. Mike rubbed the side of his pen slowly against the notebook. And you're sure about this? Wilma gave a faint smile. You asked me what happened. She paused briefly. I'm telling you. Mike shifted slightly in his chair. And the animals? He asked. Wilma nodded again. Livestock sometimes goes missing around here. She said it casually. Cows, pigs, deer that wander too close. Mike wrote that down. And you believe the creature is responsible? Wilma didn't correct him. No. Instead, she reached for a glass of water sitting on the table and took a small sip before continuing. I make sure it doesn't go looking for food anywhere else. Mike looked up again. What do you mean? Wilma set the glass down gently. I bring it something to eat. Mike paused. Regularly? Yes. Her voice remained completely calm. When animals die on nearby farms, people sometimes call me. I take care of the bodies. Mike stared at her. You feed them to it? Wilma didn't seem offended by the question. It keeps things quiet, she said. She folded her hands together again. If it stays fed, it stays down there. Mike didn't say anything for a few seconds. He was still unsure how much of this story he believed. But Wilma delivered every sentence with the same measured tone she had used since the interview began. There was no excitement in her voice, No attempt to convince him. Just statements. As if she were describing a long-standing arrangement. Mike finally asked the obvious question. "And if you didn't?" Wilma looked directly at him. Her eyes were steady. "It would come up again." The room fell silent. The wind outside pressed gently against the walls of the farmhouse. Mike glanced down at the recorder for a moment before looking back at Wilma. "And how often does it come up now?" Wilma's answer came without hesitation. "It doesn't." Mike frowned slightly. "Not anymore?" Wilma shook her head once. "No." Her voice lowered just a little. "It only comes up when it's hungry." By the time the interview finally wound down, the sun had already begun sinking toward the horizon. Mike glanced briefly at the recorder on the table and pressed the stop button. The small click of the machine seemed louder than it should have in the quiet farmhouse kitchen. They had been talking for hours. His notebook was filled with page after page of hurried handwriting. Most of it described things that would sound unbelievable to anyone reading them later. A secret wartime attack. A creature formed from soldiers. Something still living beneath the farmland. Mike didn't know yet how much of Wilma Green's story he believed. But he knew one thing for certain. It was the most unusual interview he had conducted in years. He closed the notebook and slipped it into his bag. "Well," he said, standing from the chair, "I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, Mrs. Green." Wilma rose from her seat slowly but without difficulty. "You're welcome, Mr. Smith," she said. There was no sign of fatigue in her voice, even after the long conversation. "If nothing else," she added calmly, "you'll have an interesting article." Mike gave a small smile. "That's one way to put it." They walked together through the small farmhouse toward the front door. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath their steps. Outside, the sky had turned a deep orange, the fading sunlight stretching across the wide fields surrounding the property. The air felt cooler now. Evening was settling in. Wilma opened the door and stepped outside first. Mike followed her onto the porch, carrying his bag over one shoulder. From the porch, the land looked even more isolated than it had earlier in the day. The fields extended far beyond the farmhouse, disappearing into the growing shadows of evening. The distant line of trees looked darker now. Mike paused for a moment at the top of the steps. "Beautiful place," he said. Wilma followed his gaze across the land. "It used to be busier," she replied quietly. Mike nodded. He walked down the short dirt path toward his car, which sat parked near the edge of the property where the driveway met the narrow dirt road. Wilma remained on the porch. Mike turned back briefly. "Well, thank you again," he said. "If I have any follow-up questions, I'll call." Wilma nodded once. "You drive safely, Mr. Smith." Mike opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The interior still held the warmth from sitting in the sun all afternoon. He placed his bag on the passenger seat and inserted the key into the ignition. The engine didn't start. Mike frowned slightly and turned the key again. The starter clicked. Nothing else. He tried once more. Still nothing. From the porch, Wilma watched him calmly. Mike exhaled and leaned back slightly in his seat. "Come on," he muttered to himself. He turned the key again. The engine struggled briefly, then died. Mike glanced toward the farmhouse. Wilma hadn't moved. She was still standing on the porch, hands resting lightly against the railing. Mike tried again. The engine finally caught. The car rattled to life with a rough vibration that settled into a steady idle a moment later. Mike let out a small breath of relief. "About time," he said quietly. He gave a short wave through the windshield. Wilma returned the gesture with a small nod. Mike shifted the car into gear and slowly pulled away from the farmhouse, the tires crunching over the gravel and dirt of the driveway. As he drove down the narrow road leading away from the property, the farmhouse shrank behind him. The fields stretched out on both sides. For a moment, the entire place looked peaceful again. Just farmland, just quiet land under a fading sky. Mike drove for another minute before something felt wrong. The steering wheel began pulling slightly to one side. He frowned and eased off the gas. The car slowed. The uneven sound reached him first, a dull rhythmic thumping. Mike looked down briefly at the dashboard before pulling the car to the side of the dirt road. He stepped out and walked around the vehicle. The rear tire on the passenger side had completely flattened against the ground. Mike stood there for a moment, staring at it. Then he sighed. "Perfect," he muttered under his breath. He glanced back toward the farmhouse in the distance. The evening was growing darker, and the farm was the only place nearby. Mike closed the car door and began walking back down the dirt road toward Wilma's house. By the time Mike reached the farmhouse again, the sky had darkened considerably. The last light of the day had faded behind the low hills to the west, leaving the land in that brief gray hour between sunset and night. The fields surrounding Wilma Green's property stretched out like wide shadows across the earth. The farmhouse lights were on now. Mike approached the porch again, brushing dust from his jeans as he walked. The gravel under his shoes crunched softly in the quiet. Wilma was still there. She stood exactly where he had left her, near the porch railing, as if she had never moved after watching him drive away. For a moment, Mike wondered if she had been standing there the entire time. He forced a polite smile as he stepped up onto the porch. "Sorry to bother you again," he said. Wilma tilted her head slightly. "Something wrong?" "One of my tires blew out," Mike explained. "Rear passenger side." Wilma nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. "Is there a mechanic anywhere nearby?" Mike asked. Wilma thought for a moment. "There's a small garage in the next town," she said. Mike felt a bit of relief. That would help a lot. Wilma stepped down from the porch and walked slowly across the yard toward the dirt road. Mike followed her, listening as she spoke. "The main road loops around the hills," she explained. "Adds quite a few miles." Mike nodded. "I noticed that on the way in." "No!" Wilma gestured out toward the fields stretching behind the farmhouse. "There's a faster way." Mike looked out across the land. The fields formed long corridors of dirt and grass, cut by narrow farm paths that disappeared into the distance. "You can take the service road between the fields," Wilma said. "It connects to the old access road. That'll bring you straight into town." Mike followed her pointing finger. The narrow path she indicated ran between two long stretches of farmland. The road looked rough but passable. "How far is it?" Mike asked. "Not long," Wilma said calmly. "Maybe 10 minutes." Mike considered it for a moment. "All right," he said. "That's better than waiting out here all night." Wilma nodded again. "You'll see the road once you pass the second set of fields." Mike thanked her again and returned to his car. He opened the trunk and checked briefly for the spare tire, but the dirt road wasn't the kind of place he wanted to change it in the dark if he didn't have to. Better to reach the town. He climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine. The car pulled slowly away from the farmhouse again. This time, instead of turning back toward the highway, Mike followed the narrow path Wilma had described. The road between the fields was tighter than he expected. Tall grass brushed the sides of the vehicle as he drove forward. The tires kicked up small clouds of dust behind him. The land around him grew darker as night began to settle fully across the valley. For several minutes, the drive seemed normal. The road ran straight ahead between the long rows of farmland. Mike kept his eyes on the faint tracks ahead of him, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure he was still following the path correctly. Then the fields ended. Mike slowed the car slightly. According to Wilma's instructions, the town should have appeared somewhere beyond the farmland. Instead, the road curved toward a small wooded area. A cluster of dark trees stood directly ahead. Mike frowned. "That's odd," he muttered. He slowed the car to a stop. The engine idled quietly while he stared through the windshield. There were no lights ahead, no buildings, no sign of a town, just trees. Mike reached for the door handle and stepped out of the car. The night air felt colder now. The fields behind him were silent. He walked a few steps forward, scanning the dark tree line in front of him, trying to spot any sign of a road continuing beyond the woods. Nothing. The path simply ended there. Mike ran a hand over the back of his neck. "Great," he muttered under his breath. Maybe he had misunderstood the directions. Maybe he had taken the wrong path between the fields. He turned around, preparing to head back toward the farmhouse. That was when he heard it, the low hum of another engine. Mike froze. Headlights appeared behind him on the narrow dirt road. A car slowly approached from the direction of the farm. Mike squinted into the lights as the vehicle rolled closer. The car stopped several yards behind his own. The driver's door opened. Wilma stepped out. Mike blinked in surprise. She closed the door and walked slowly toward him, her figure partially illuminated by the headlights behind her. For a moment, Mike simply stared. "Mrs. Green?" he said. Wilma kept walking until she stood a few feet away from him. Mike gestured vaguely toward the dark trees ahead. "I thought you said the town was past the fields." Wilma didn't answer right away. She simply looked past him toward the edge of the woods. Mike frowned. "Why are you here?" he asked, confusion creeping into his voice. "Did something happen?" Wilma didn't answer Mike's question. For a moment, she simply stood there, her face illuminated faintly by the headlights of her car behind her. The beam of light cut across the dirt road and reached the edge of the trees ahead, turning the first few trunks pale while everything deeper in the woods remained swallowed by darkness. Mike waited. "Mrs. Green?" he asked again. She still didn't look at him. Instead, Wilma stepped past him. Her movements were slow but steady as she walked along the side of the road toward the tree line. The gravel crunched quietly under her shoes. Mike turned slightly, watching her. "Did I miss the turn or something?" he said. Wilma continued walking. She stopped just a few feet from where the dirt road met the edge of the woods. For a second, the only sound was the engine of Mike's car idling behind them. Then Wilma spoke, but not to Mike. Her voice carried clearly across the dark field and into the trees. "Come out, darling." Mike frowned. Wilma's head tilted slightly toward the ground. "Dinner is ready." The words hung in the air for only a moment. Then the ground moved. At first, Mike thought it was his imagination, a faint vibration beneath his feet. Then the dirt road trembled again. Harder this time. Mike instinctively stepped back. "What the?" The vibration grew stronger. Somewhere beneath the soil, something massive shifted. The sound that followed didn't resemble anything Mike had ever heard before. It was deep and wet and heavy, like something enormous dragging itself through thick earth. The dirt ahead of Wilma cracked. Mike stared. The ground split open in a jagged line several feet long. Chunks of soil broke apart and collapsed inward as something pushed upward from beneath the surface. Mike's heart began pounding. "What is that?" he shouted. Wilma didn't answer. She simply stood there, watching. The ground burst open. A massive shape forced its way upward through the torn earth. At first, Mike could only make out movement, limbs unfolding in unnatural directions as the thing rose from the hole it had created. And then the headlights behind him caught the creature fully. Mike froze. The body was enormous. A thick central mass supported several long arms that unfolded outward, each limb bending at unnatural angles before ending in clawed hands. The arms moved independently, stretching and flexing as if testing the air. 4 legs pushed the creature upright, though they were twisted and elongated in ways that made its posture unstable. The head rose last, or what passed for a head. Multiple eyes reflected the headlights at once. 8 of them. They blinked independently as the creature slowly lifted itself out of the ground. Its skin looked stretched and uneven, like something that had once belonged to many bodies but no longer followed the shape of any one of them. Mike stumbled backward. His mind tried to reject what he was seeing. The interview, Wilma's story, the soldiers, the creature. Every word she had said rushed back through his thoughts all at once. It hadn't been a story. The creature fully pulled itself free of the ground. Several of its arms extended outward, gripping the edges of the broken earth as it raised its body higher. One of the long limbs turned slowly toward Mike. The eyes followed. Mike felt his stomach drop. Behind him, the engine of his car continued humming quietly. He realized something then. The tire, the shortcut, the road that led nowhere. Mike slowly turned his head toward Wilma. She was watching the creature calmly, not afraid, not surprised. Mike felt the truth settle into place. "You knew," he said quietly. Wilma didn't deny it. She finally looked at him. The expression on her face was almost gentle. "You seemed like a good man," she said. Mike's pulse pounded in his ears. "You invited me here." Wilma nodded slightly. The creature shifted again, one of its long arms stretching toward Mike across the dirt road. "You've been feeding it," Mike said. Wilma looked back toward the creature. "For a very long time," she replied. Mike understood now. The interview, the story, the kindness, none of it had been coincidence. She hadn't been telling him a legend. She had been explaining exactly what lived beneath the land, and exactly how it stayed there. Mike took a slow step backward, but the creature was already moving. Several arms slid across the ground with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them. Wilma spoke again, almost softly. "Don't worry," she said. "It won't take long." Mike's last thought arrived with perfect clarity. Wilma had never planned to feed it another animal. Tonight, the creature wasn't getting a carcass from a farm. Tonight, it was getting him.